Hello, my name is Richard Fennell and I'd like to talk to you today about using Typemock Isolator to enable rapid development in areas of your development process that you might not initially consider it being a useful tool. At Black Marble we do quite a lot of development in the Sharepoint space. Now Sharepoint brings its own set of development problems. The key of these is the sheer scale of the product. Any developer who needs to work on Sharepoint needs their own instance of Sharepoint to work upon. This is quite a sizable install, requiring that they're running on a server operating system and that they have a good collection of resources available behind that. We often find that one of the easiest ways to manage this is to actually operate inside a virtual environment, so storing a snapshotted SharePoint environment in Hyper-V and then making use of that for developers can be quite a useful tactic. This all means there's a lot of stuff to manage, and when there's a lot of stuff to manage, things tend to be a little bit slow. As soon as you start copying around virtual machines or starting dev environments inside virtual machines, the actual deployment and debugging and test process of your application can really slow down, and we've very much found this with Sharepoint. The act of pressing F5, even with automated deploys, can take a minute or two to get your web part up and onto the system for you to have a look at. Now that said, Visual Studio 2010 and SharePoint 2010 have greatly eased this process, and many of the problems do go away. But the technique I'm about to outline is equally valid with older versions of SharePoint and with 2010. It can be a really quick way to get some stuff working. So, in SharePoint we have this complex architecture. Buried in the middle of it we have the web part that we've written. That sits on a SharePoint page, which sits inside SharePoint, which talks to some other forms of resources. By using Isolator, what we can do is we can take our SharePoint web part and deploy it into a simple ASPX form and then sit it on top of Typemock Isolator. This allows us to do all of our SharePoint development outside of SharePoint, thus removing all of the issues of deploying, the delays that takes. Now if we assume that pressing the F5 button and getting the application to deploy takes 30 seconds, which in my experience will be quite quick, this technique, if it can save us 20-30 seconds every time we press F5, that can be a great saving. So, how do we actually implement this? I have here a simple SharePoint web part. As you can see, there's some basic boilerplate that we'd normally expect, some properties, and the bulk of the logic is in the create child controls area. We create a table, we get our current URL from the server context, we then grab the SP site that this web part is hosted upon, we iterate through it, we find a SharePoint list, and we pull some data out of the list and create an item that we then display on the screen. A not uncommon process. I find that many SharePoint web parts render data that they have gathered from somewhere. It's a very core idea. Now, normally to test that we'd have to write a WSP, we'd have to deploy it out to SharePoint, we would then have to fire up our instance of a browser and look to see that it was doing what we wanted. But there is a quicker way of doing it. The first point is we don't actually need to deploy it into SharePoint. A web part is a standard .NET item and it can be rendered inside an ASP.NET page. So if we look at this ASP.NET page, we have declared the fact that we are interested in our demo web part. We add a web part manager, a web part zone, and declaratively add our web part to the page. Now it is important to do this declaratively because if we try and do it with the personalization services, it would require that our test web page would also require access to a SQL server. By doing it this way we can avoid that step. So we have a little web page, and inside the load event we can set any parameters that we're interested in for our web part. Equally we could have set that inside the ASPX page if we'd required. So that's just a web page that can be hosted inside our development environment, and we can just view it in a browser. So I will click on that page and we get an error, and it's the error we would expect. We can see that we're trying to make calls at line 60 which go in and they try and talk to SP site items. So we can't actually render that because ASP.NET does not have any SharePoint knowledge. It is not a SharePoint server, it is a web server. But by using Typemock we can get around this problem. If we go and have a look at a page that's constructed in exactly the same manner, but inside its load event, we had a couple of test helpers. Now these test helpers are nothing clever, they're standard pieces of isolator code that create SharePoint items. They're purely in a test helper class just to make my code look a little neater. So the first thing that we need to do is create our fake SharePoint site. So if we go over and look at the helpers, we use standard Typemock Isolator syntax to create a fake site and say when we get our next call, or the next call to a SharePoint site, pass us the fake one that's just been created. We then create a list of SharePoint list items, which we then iterate through using a simple for loop to populate them. We then finally say when on the SharePoint site someone asks for this set of list items, return the collection we've just created. The second call is to fake the context URL, which is where we found out the URL that the website thinks it is running on. Again, I've put that into a little helper class, and again it's the standard syntax for faking a static method call. So we call the parent controls, we get the context, we don't care what parameters are passed in, and when we're asked for a URL we return mocksite.com, our made up site. So by the simple addition of these two calls from a helper class using standard SharePoint calls, we can actually go back on here and call the other version of our page with these mock calls in it, and we get a little site being rendered. We can see our site name and we can see the 3 rows of populated data, and we can see it's just been rendered a few moments ago. So what have we seen there? SharePoint is a big and complex solution. You need to put a lot of resources in for the developer to actually do any work. And even when you properly resource the developer, you often find that their development cycle is quite slow just due to the nature of SharePoint. This is particularly irritating while working on little SharePoint and web parts like the one we've just seen, because much of the work that you'll be doing will be worried about the CSS, the styling, the JavaScript that's embedded inside the web part, not in the actual SharePoint functionality that requires a call to the underlying SharePoint. What we have found is by mocking out the calls to SharePoint inside a little static web page like that, we can take nearly all of the design side work, and when I say design I mean the HTML, CSS, styling style design of the web work, out of the sandboxed environment of SharePoint itself. This has 2 benefits. One is speed. We can press the F5 button, the page will load, we can have a look to see what we're doing, we can tweak a style sheet, we can reload, it's very, very fast. The other one is we just don't need as much resources. A standard low-powered machine is quite happy in doing that sort of work, whereas if we want to run a SharePoint instance, we're looking at quite a significant machine. It needs a good amount of memory, it needs to be fast, and you've also got the issues of making sure it's in the right state, so you're often having to worry about virtual machines and all of the management that goes in with that. So, Typemock Isolator does provide a really valuable tool for standard unit testing inside SharePoint because it can mock out, unlike most of the other mocking tools that are available, most of the components of SharePoint. SharePoint isn't designed for mocking. It does require the special features of Isolator to allow you to make any progress. But where we've seen the most benefit when using Isolator with SharePoint is in this removal of the need to actually test much of our code inside the SharePoint environment as we're going along. This has been a great boon to the projects we've worked on and has really helped us move forward in rapid SharePoint development. So I've been talking about SharePoint here, but there's no reason why similar techniques can't be used against any environment that puts a heavy load upon the development tools. So if you can avoid the call to the original site by actually faking it out with Isolator, you are potentially onto a very fast way of doing development, and often a great entry point into automating far more of your acceptance and integration tests, because you've already done the basic work whilst doing the development process. Well, I hope you found this short video useful and to give you some good ideas on how you can use Isolator in ways that you hadn't immediately thought of. If we're going to be of any help, please don't hesitate to contact us.